أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. يا أيها المزمل قم الليل إلا قليلا نصفه أو انقص منه قليلا أو زد عليه ورتل القرآن ترتيلا إنا سنلقي عليك قولا ثقيلا إن ناشعة الليل هي أشد وطئا وأقوم قيلا إن لك في النهار سبحا طويلا واذكر اسم ربك وتبتل إليه تبتيلا رب المشرق والمغرب لا إله إلا هو فاتخذه وكيلا واصبر على ما يقولون واهجرهم هجرا جميلا وذرني والمكذبين أولي النعمة ومهلهم قليلا إن لدينا أنكالا وجحيما وطعاما ذا غصة وعذابا أليما يوم ترجف الأرض والجبال وكانت الجبال وكثيبا محيلا إنا أرسلنا إليكم رسولا شاهدا عليكم كما أرسلنا إلى فرعون رسولا فعسى فرعون الرسول فأخذناه أخذا وبيلا فكيف تتقون إن كفرتم يوم يجعل ولدان شيبا السماء منفطر به كان وعده مفعولا إن هذه تذكرة فمن شاء اتخذ إلى ربه سبيلا إن ربك يعلم أنك تقوم أدنى من ثلثي الليل ونصفه وثلثه وطائفة من الذين معك والله يقدر الليل والنهار علم أن لن تحصوه فتاب عليكم فاقرأوا ما تيسر من القرآن علم أن سيكون منكم مرضى وآخرون يضربون في الأرض يبتغون من فضل الله وآخرون يقاتلون في سبيل الله فاقرأوا ما تيسر منه وأقيموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأقرضوا الله قرضا حسنا وما تقدموا لأنفسكم من خير تجدوه عند الله هو خير وأعظم أجرا واستغفر الله إن الله غفور رحيم صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Brothers and sisters, we're very fortunate today to be joined by Halla Keir, who will be talking about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and the role of aid agencies. Please welcome her with a salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Halla is the Advocacy and Research Officer at Medical Aid for Palestine, a UK-registered charity working in partnership with Palestinian communities to uphold their rights to health and dignity in the occupied Palestinian territory and Lebanon. Prior to joining MAP, Halla was a research analyst at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington D.C. Please welcome her with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum, and thank you everyone for coming here today. As I was introduced, my name is Halla Keir and I'm the Advocacy and Research Officer at Medical Aid for Palestinians. MAP is a charity that is based in the UK, but we operate across the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank, Gaza and Lebanon, working alongside Palestinian communities and partners towards a future where they all have their rights to health and dignity realised. thank you, towards a future where they all have their rights to health and dignity realised, and where they have their own locally led and sustainable healthcare system. 2024 marks 40 years of the founding of Medical Aid for Palestinians, and we had hoped to celebrate the organisation's achievements this year. Instead, we're responding to the greatest emergency and the biggest disaster for Palestinians since the Nakba in 1948. Words themselves have been becoming inadequate to describe the horror that Palestinians are facing across the West Bank and Gaza, but particularly in Gaza. After 6 months of indiscriminate bombardment and siege imposed by the Israeli forces, more than 34,000 Palestinians have been killed, more than 78,000 injured, and more than 1.7 million displaced from their homes. The fact is, there are no words to describe that. And even if there were, Palestinians don't need more words, they need action. For 6 months, as I mentioned, the Israeli government has imposed siege on Palestinians and is now on trial at the world's highest court, which has ordered them to enable more aid and assistance to get into Gaza and into the people that need it the most. But instead, it has refused to accept the rulings of the court and the jurisdiction of the court, and so the horror continues. As ever, there is no accountability for Israel's actions. The international community was told 7 months ago that this would lead to mass starvation and famine, and yet we saw no action. Our leaders refused to act. MAP stood outside the International Hunger Summit and warned that these would be the inevitable consequences. But again, we saw no action. And so those consequences have borne out before us. Famine is now officially imminent in Gaza, which means it will arrive at some point over the next month. It is too late to stop it. All we can do is reduce how bad it is. The window of preventing it has closed. People are already dying of starvation, and as ever, it's the youngest children. We've had reports from Kamal Adwan Hospital in northern Gaza of 20 to 30 children a day arriving malnourished. 1 in 3 children under the age of 2 in northern Gaza are suffering from acute malnutrition. That is the fastest decline in the population's nutritional status ever recorded. That means that Gaza's children are being starved faster than anywhere else in history and anywhere else in the world. The official assessment has warned that famine will move from north to south, and that will only be exacerbated by Israel's latest escalation in Rafah in the south of Gaza. It means that unless massive amounts of aid are allowed to get in, but also able to be distributed, we will see disastrous consequences for the 2.1 million Palestinians living there. That also means that mass amounts of aid are needed to get to the hospitals. When we talk about starvation and malnutrition, we're at the point now where food is not the solution. Many of these people require medical treatment, will require specialist medicines and hospital beds, but there are so few hospitals left functioning. The Israeli military has conducted more than 400 attacks on healthcare in Gaza over the past 6 months and killed 493 healthcare workers. That is more healthcare workers killed than in any conflict combined in 2021 and 2022 combined. The Israeli army has targeted almost every hospital, leaving none fully functional, leaving the 2 million Palestinians living there under intense military assault and facing a public health catastrophe of starvation, dehydration, and infectious diseases without the necessary access to healthcare. We have been warning for months that Israeli forces are systematically dismantling the healthcare system, hospital by hospital, clinic by clinic, to the point that there is no longer a single fully functioning hospital left. And yet these attacks continue, without accountability and with impunity. Shifa Hospital, once Gaza's largest in the north, was taken out of action after a 2-week military raid and siege, which saw people trapped there without access to food and medical assistance, patients unable to be evacuated, doctors unable to do their jobs. Nasser Hospital, the largest in the south and Gaza's second largest hospital, was forced out of action after it was raided by the Israeli military. The Indonesian hospital has been partially destroyed, Al-Quds Hospital partially destroyed, Al-Rantisi Hospital partially destroyed, Al-Amal Hospital forced to close. I could go on, the list is endless. And the awful killing by the Israeli forces of 7 charity workers at the World Central Kitchen distributing food shocked and angered leaders across the world, as it should have done. Their deaths are a tragedy, and we grieve for them as we do the 268 other aid workers who have been killed, that have been attacked and killed by Israeli forces over the past 6 months. They have put their lives on the line to ensure that aid not only gets into Gaza, but that it gets to the people who need it, whether they be in the north or the south. But Israel's expanding military operation into the southern city of Rafah risks thousands more civilian deaths and injuries, but is also threatening the functioning of that humanitarian aid system itself. MAP and other humanitarian agencies have long warned that this would be a catastrophe if it is allowed to go ahead, and unfortunately it has been as of Monday. International law requires that aid workers are protected, that assistance gets to the people in need, and that Israel, as the occupying power, makes sure that it arrives to those people that it occupies. Instead, the opposite is happening. Our greatest fear now, with the onset of the Rafah incursion, is that some or all of our dear colleagues will continue to struggle and some may not survive. 2 of our staff have miraculously come out from under the rubble of airstrikes. Like all Palestinians in Gaza, they have lost family and friends in the bombing. Asma, our neonatal specialist, survived an airstrike that killed her young daughter, 3 years old, 2 of her sisters and her grandmother. Asma and her surviving sister had serious leg injuries, and her 2-year-old daughter, Rima, had a fractured skull and brain damage. Alhamdulillah, she has been evacuated to Qatar, where she is receiving treatment, where Rima is receiving treatment. Mohammed, his niece, Fatima, was killed in an airstrike, and he had to run to Shifa Hospital while it was under attack to rescue his second niece, who was injured in the same bombing. Israeli troops fired over his head as he ran down the street with her wheelchair. Nauraz, whose son was a taxi driver, was killed by an airstrike on his taxi. Abia in Gaza City has been eating animal feed, but has warned us that the animal feed is running out. With the horse and donkey food running out and being used up, he had been living off of small amounts of bird food. Mahmoud, also in the north of Gaza, tried to flee south with his elderly parents, but could not manage the long walk past Israeli tanks without the accessible routes for his parents to use, and could not find any wheelchairs for them to use. He remains in the north, doing his best to help all Palestinians in the north have access to the aid that they need to survive. And we know that this will get so much worse. Again, we have been warning for months that an assault on Rafah will be catastrophic. Rafah is the main crossing point for assistance and aid to get into Gaza. But on Tuesday, Israeli forces took over and closed the Rafah crossing, as well as the Kerem Shalom crossing. And it's not just Gaza. I don't want to forget about what is happening in the West Bank too, where more than 110 Palestinian children have been killed by Israeli forces since the 7th of October, which has necessitated MAP's biggest humanitarian response in our history. It is both horrifying and incredible on behalf of my colleagues that they are able to continue working and that we are one of the only humanitarian organisations still functioning in northern Gaza. Thanks to the extraordinary groundswell of support that we've had from people in over 160 countries, including this one, we've been able to deliver millions of dollars worth of medical supplies, hygiene kits, dignity kits, and warm clothes. We've deployed 6 emergency medical teams made up of international experts to support local Palestinian healthcare workers responding to the influx of injuries and infections arriving at hospitals, at great personal risk to themselves. But we know that is a drop in the ocean of what is needed, in a place where the health system and the humanitarian system are in the midst of collapse. And as I've mentioned, while Israel's assault on Rafah and the closure of the Rafah crossing is ongoing, it has made it virtually impossible for aid agencies like MAP to import and distribute aid, forcing our teams to limit their movement, to ration their fuel. But having said that, our team in Gaza nevertheless continues to do whatever they can to support their communities. In Khan Yunis, in the middle area, I referenced Nasser Hospital that was put out of action by Israeli forces. We're now working with partners to rehabilitate and rebuild that hospital's capacity to receive and treat patients. It is a horrifying situation, but we really would not be able to do what we are able to do without the incredible strength of my colleagues, aid workers and health workers in Gaza. And I don't tell their stories so that we feel pity and sympathy, but so we can take strength and learn from them to put into our own action here. We are incredibly grateful for the groundswell of support that we've had across the UK and across the world, not just financially, but in terms of solidarity, speaking out for Palestinians, speaking out for a ceasefire, speaking out for accountability. And so I want to say thank you to everybody who has supported MAP and Palestinians in Gaza until this point. We're so incredibly grateful for the people's generosity and their solidarity, their voice and their actions, because it really does make a difference. We ask, as community members, that you all continue to make your voices heard, that you continue to make sure that this government and your elected representatives are calling for a ceasefire, are calling for accountability for attacks on Palestinian healthcare, and are calling for a long-term solution that addresses the root causes of Palestinians' health needs. On the 20th of October, 2 Palestinian doctors in Al-Awda Hospital in northern Gaza wrote a message to the world on a whiteboard in a hospital. They said, "Whoever stays until the end will tell the story. We did what we could. Remember us." They were killed by Israeli forces, but I hope we take their message forward. We remember them and we do what we can. Thank you, and if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
We have some time for questions if anybody has questions.
Assalamu alaikum. I think one of the things that's certainly been putting me off in terms of donating to MAP is just thinking, well, you could have so much, but getting stuff into Gaza is impossible. So how are you getting into Gaza at the moment?
So until Monday, we were able to get very limited amounts of aid in. We were one of few organisations that was able to get assistance in with the Egyptian Red Crescent Society through the Rafah crossing. So that meant that we were able to get food parcels, hygiene kits, medical supplies to hospitals and people in the south, but especially in the north. I think we were one of 3 organisations that still had staff operating in the north, which meant we were able to deliver blankets, mattresses, and also get emergency medical teams in. So we've had 6 teams of specialist doctors from across the world travelling to Gaza, working in first Al-Aqsa Hospital and then Nasser Hospital to alleviate some of the burden on Palestinian healthcare workers. Having said that, Rafah crossing is now closed, which means that nobody is getting aid in. Our teams are still doing what they can to distribute what we have, and we know that this will be a long recovery for Gaza. And so every bit of support that we get at the moment is going to the need where it is needed and to where we're able to get it. But it will also help us support a long-term recovery plan, including rehabilitating Nasser Hospital, which is what we're doing at the moment.
Do you have any questions on the ladies' side? Or anyone else have any questions?
Thank you for that presentation. Really appreciate the update. In the early days following the 7th of October, we're fortunate with a colleague, Dr. Mohammed Asari, to have visited MAP's offices and had Melanie and the head of the Gaza program, Fikr, present both the emergency response and the long-term, the 8 areas in which you want to support the long-term reconstruction. It's also quite heartening and validating everything you said to see how you were leading medical clusters in getting the response, but both securing it's passing the Rafah crossing, getting it to where it's needed, initially through warehouses, spoking out, but then making sure that doctors and nurses got the supplies and were credited to use them. In terms of the longer term stuff, my expectation is all on hold until things settle down a bit. Have we been operating for the last 7+ months in emergency response mode, or are there glimmers of hope that the longer term plans that you had put in place way back in November last year can be seen to come to fruition, particularly given the loss of lives in medical professionals? And if you get a chance, and I can just put a question 1 part B in, The mass graves outside the hospitals, any sort of light shed on that? Are these, atrocities committed within hospitals, on medical staff, on patients? Is there a wider narrative there as well, if you've got anything on that, please?
Absolutely. In response to your first question, I think as you alluded to, the emergency response for us and getting what we can to people in need right now is absolutely the priority. But we've been doing this work for 40 years, and we know that this is probably the most destruction we have seen in Gaza ever, and we know that even from 2008, many homes hadn't been rebuilt, much infrastructure hadn't been rebuilt. We know that this is going to be a long-term process, and so we're absolutely looking at what those long-term needs are, trying to identify where the gaps are and where MAP can be most useful in coordination with the kind of coordination groups, the Health Cluster, the World Health Organization. We don't want to be in a position where there is a ceasefire and we are unprepared. And so we are doing everything we can, both to respond to the emergency, like the right now emergency, but also making sure that we are prepared for the long term, whether that's 1 year, 5 years from now. In response to the question on the mass graves, that has been a truly horrifying discovery. We know from reports from the UN and the Palestinian Civil Defense that people have been found with their hands tied, evidence of potential torture or inhumane treatment, women, children, men. We don't know the exact circumstances, and what we are calling for and what should absolutely be abided by is an investigation, an international independent investigation, so that Palestinian families who are missing their loved ones get some clarity, get the information that they need, and get justice. And I'll note that actually about an hour ago, the UN Security Council put out a press statement calling for, I think, impartial and independent investigations. The initial draft called for international investigations, but that was removed after complaints from the US and the UK. And so I just want to, I'm very aware that I'm here speaking from a health and humanitarian perspective, but MAP operates in a context where we know that the health needs we respond to are not occurring in a vacuum. They are the result of political, social, economic choices. And so while we absolutely continue to ask and need people's financial support, we also need a change in the political atmosphere. It's why we have an advocacy team that exists to address the barriers to Palestinian healthcare, and those barriers include the impunity that the US and the UK continue to afford to Israeli forces.
Thank you for the talk. I just wanted to ask about the kind of reports we see of Israeli citizens blocking the aid via the Israeli crossing. Is there any aid getting through there, or is it completely blocked by these groups of people, not wanting aid to get into Gaza?
So we get most of our aid in through Egypt and Rafah, so I can't speak to MAP's aid. My understanding is that there have absolutely been blockages, delays. I don't know that it has fully stopped aid getting through Israel, the state of Israel, but what I will say is that because the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings have been closed since Monday, any aid is not getting into Gaza through those main two crossing points at the moment.
Thank you for that talk. It was really, really interesting, and the facts are just, speak for themselves. What do you see as the end point here? Like, what do you think will happen? What can we do? You're saying that from Monday you haven't managed to get aid in because Rafah is now blocked. What can we do to help in any way that we can? That was it.
Your first question, are you asking me what I think the end point should be? Or what it will be?
Both, actually.
What I think the end point should be is a ceasefire immediately, permanent. I think it should be accountability for violations of international law. That includes through mechanisms like the International Criminal Court, the UN Commission of Inquiry. And I think it includes Palestinians being involved in every single policy-making conversation about them, whether that is rebuilding Gaza, whether that is about a long-term political solution. It should involve Palestinians, and it should also involve the rebuilding of the healthcare system specifically, again, with a mind for Palestinian self-determination within that context. What do I think it will be? I can't answer that question. I had thought in October that we wouldn't necessarily be in this point, and we warned that if we let it get to this point, we would see famine and starvation on a mass scale. We would see mass civilian casualties as a result of indiscriminate bombing. I had hoped that by this point, the pursuance of accountability at the International Court of Justice, the issuance of provisional measures, would have been abided by, if not by Israeli forces and the Israeli authorities, but by third states who would hold Israel to account for not abiding by those things. We're not there. We're seeing slight shifts, and I will take them for all they're worth. We have seen the opposition in this country now calling for a ceasefire. Far too late, far too little. But that is important. We are seeing governments talk about abiding by international law. Far too late, far too little. But it is important. But what it will take for them to get to the next step of actually upholding it, of forcing Israeli forces to uphold it, of holding them to account, I don't know when that will be. But I think what has shifted the dial, and this comes on to your second question about what we can do, has been the public, and it has been pressure, and it has been showing out and telling your elected representatives that actually, no, this matters to me. I'm not okay with this. We should never have been okay with this. And I think that has had far more, and I can say this speaking as an advocacy person, the impact of people speaking out in their communities has had far more of an impact than I could have imagined. And it is important, and it is strong, and please continue to do that. And so when you ask what you can do, we are, sorry to clarify, we have aid waiting at Rafah right now, but that doesn't mean that we've stopped operating in Gaza. Like I say, we are rehabilitating Nasser Hospital. We do have staff who are working to do that. We are distributing what we are able to distribute. But again, we know that our staff are putting themselves at risk doing that without a ceasefire. And so again, I just want to re-emphasize, please continue to make your voices heard, write to your representatives, go to their constituency clinics and speak to them, make your voices heard in every way that you possibly can to call for an immediate ceasefire, access to aid and accountability and justice for Palestinians.
Do you think the general public view has changed, or is it just Muslims, or do you think general layman on the street, do you think their view has changed?
I guess it depends on the time that you're asking me. I personally have seen far more of a groundswell of support and a recognition of Palestinians' humanity over the past 6 months than I have ever seen doing this work. And I don't think that's just amongst Muslims. I would also say we ran some polling back in January, and it was there was some polling again in March and April by Action for Humanity. And you see overwhelmingly that the British public across demographics wants a ceasefire. More than 70% of people want a ceasefire. More than 50% of people, according to the last 2 polls, want the UK to stop selling arms to Israel.
But they don't go on Question Time.
I haven't seen the latest questions.
Are there any further questions?
Thank you very much again for your excellent talk and also the marvelous work your organization is doing. A few weeks ago, we had with big fanfare these airdrops, aid being parachuted into central and North Gaza, and also the building of the US pier. Has that made any difference whatsoever? Has that reduced the risk of famine, in your opinion?
Look, I mean, any aid is aid and any food is food, and we will absolutely welcome any effort to get more in. But absolutely anybody in the humanitarian community will tell you that those airdrops are the least efficient, the least effective, and are a drop in the ocean in terms of what is needed. We're talking, prior to October 7th, Gaza was getting around 500 trucks of assistance a day. Now they're getting around 100. But the needs are so much higher. Actually, probably what you're talking about is 1,000 trucks a day. A few airdrops are never going to meet that need. And so they are getting food to people in need, and that is critical, but it's not enough to stop famine. It is not enough to stave off the famine. We know that the World Food Programme has declared that northern Gaza, as of last week, is officially in famine. So, unfortunately, no, those airdrops did not stave off, and again, we're just nowhere near the scale that we're required. But I also want to be clear, again, Israel is the occupying power of Gaza. It is Israel's responsibility to make sure that the Palestinian population in Gaza has access to the food, the water, the medical assistance that it needs. And I think we need to be clear that actually it is their responsibility and they need to be held accountable for actively denying it and frustrating the delivery of it.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. Just a quick question. Sorry if you've answered it earlier on in your talk. I know personally I've read reports, especially on social media, about how the Israeli occupying force was being very specific with not allowing a lot of things in when prior to Monday, when some aid was getting in. For example, scissors or batteries, etc., because it could be used, potentially for like making weapons or something. So I was wondering if you can comment on whether that's actually true. Have you guys had to alter your aid to kind of meet those, very stringent kind of standards? Limits. And the other question I had also kind of linked to this was that also I've heard reports of trucks coming in half full, so potentially half of the aid being removed by Israel somehow for whatever reason. So you can just comment on those two, whether it's happened to you guys at all. Thank you very much.
So in terms of what we are able to send into Gaza, we basically work on a needs assessment, what is needed the most by the hospitals and the communities that we work with, and we will send that through for approval to try and get in. The restrictions are totally arbitrary. And so when you hear a story, for example, as you mentioned, of scissors not getting in, they may not get in one day, and then they may get in the next day. They may get approved in advance, but then arrive at the border and get turned back. So I've heard reports from Oxfam of dates being denied because they have the pits in them. The dates must be pitted. I've heard reports of sleeping bags that are green being turned back because green could be seen as military fatigue. But it changes on the day-to-day. It's totally arbitrary. I could not sit here and tell you, these things are okay and these things are not, because there is no, it changes kind of clear, yes, these things get in and these things don't. With regards to your second question, which was trucks arriving half full, so I don't actually have the clarity on that. I understand that there was a kind of logistical, bureaucratic challenge with trucks were arriving half full at one checkpoint and then being condensed into kind of one, two half-filled trucks are condensed into one full truck. And I know there was a challenge there because Israeli forces were essentially counting the number of half-filled trucks that arrived at the border and saying, we let this many amount in. But actually, when you combine them all, it's probably about half the amount. I'm not aware that that is down to Israeli forces removing things or whether it's down to, the way that different organizations work. I don't have the clarity on that, but I can definitely find out and follow up if that's something of interest.
Any further questions? Okay, we'll have a short break.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for your talk. Just a question. So if there was a ceasefire, what would the future look like? Because I've heard things like the rubble would take 10 years or something just to clear up. So what does rebuilding Gaza look like? Thanks.
That's a great question, and I think you kind of answered it in your question, which is a ceasefire doesn't bring perfection. It doesn't bring the solution. A ceasefire just allows us to do our jobs better. As you say, reports that the rubble will take 10 years to clear. No fully functioning hospitals right now. Shifa Hospital, the largest hospital, defunct, unable to be rehabilitated at the moment because of the level of damage to it. And actually, very difficult for example, the UN who does these assessments, to do these assessments if they're not able to get the clearance and the protection that they need to go to that hospital and assess what is needed. And so I can't give you specifics on exactly what happens on day one afterwards. Probably what happens is a lot of assessments, figuring out exactly what is left. And that's why I have lots of questions and conversations about rebuilding and what that looks like and when that comes and how we should approach it. And don't get me wrong, as I've said, I don't think we should be at a point where a ceasefire happens and we're not prepared for it. But actually it matters what happens today when we're talking about tomorrow. It matters how many hospitals are left standing. It matters how many schools are left standing. It matters how many doctors are left. And we won't know the scale of the damage. We won't know the total scale of the destruction until we're able to do our jobs properly and actually assess it with a ceasefire.
Thank you very much, Halla. We will now have a short break before Salah in 5 minutes, inshallah.